What you see in front of you are most of the components that would be fitted to a 1960 John Deere two-cylinder 430 tractor equipped with power steering. If you watched any of my previous videos on my little 430 standard restoration project, I've probably mentioned that it's had factory power steering a time or two. And this video, or series of videos, is going to document how we cleaned everything up and got it looking to where you see it here. Rather than have one long mega video, I'm probably going to break it down into chapters. We'll talk about the flow divider, the pedestal, and maybe the pump in their own separate sections, so it's not to lose your interest. There'll probably be a little repetition at the beginning, kind of covering power steering system, how it all fits together, but a little redundancy is a small price to pay for a shorter video, I suppose. In Chapter 1 of our Dubuque Power Steering Rebuild video series, we touched on the flow divider valve, and with the flow divider all assorted, we can move on to Chapter 2, the front pedestal. If you had a 420, 430, 440 with factory power steering, this is what your front pedestal is going to look like, the exception being the tricycle tractor. Tricycle tractors, even with a wide front, had a different way of connecting to the wheels. So you're not going to have this long pinion sticking out of the bottom. The tricycle version has a shorter pinion with splines on the end inside the housing. But if you had a standard, a utility, a row crop utility, a special, a high crop, this is what your pedestal is going to look like. And what we can do now is jump back in time and start from the beginning, tear it apart, see what it took to get us here. To start, I'm going to start at the top. I'm going to take the cover off of our steering box. These get pretty messy a lot of times. Guys will fill these with grease or some other nasty fluid. So we'll see what lives in there and kind of work our way down. If we take the cover off, we should be able to pull our little baby shaft out, a little 1/2 inch wrench. Okay, bolts out. Well, that one's not too greasy at all, but got a little cover. Here's our little baby shaft, and you can see the kind of the worm gear right in here. And these two pins on the shaft will ride in these little grooves. So I think we can just wiggle him out of there. There's going to be a little tension on the coupling, but I don't believe there's any retaining pin or anything down there that holds them in. We should be able to pop him out in theory. Well, he'd rather stay in there for now. That's okay. What we're going to do is move down to our 3 bolts that hold this little cast component to the steering box. In fact, we can do that. We can take these 2 bolts that hold the steering box off as well. There's a combination of different sizes here. And the other side is simply a bolt that kind of screws up into a threaded insert in this box itself. Fun fact, this is almost the same, if not the same, as a lug nut you would use on one of the front wheels on these tractors. But let's see if our pieces want to separate here. We put leverage on equal points. And stubborn. Well, if that's the case, we're going to move to the 3 5/8 bolts that are holding them on there. All right, those out. Everything's wanting to wiggle and move. Our coupling's still holding us a little bit. We'll use a little bit of gentle persuasion. There we go. Like I said, what we're trying to do here is get our little splined end of our little baby shaft. It's about here, to pull out this way. At least that's in theory what we're going to try and do. There we go. Well, we are pulling our whole shaft. There's a bearing right here that sits down inside this piece. Typically that stays in there and it doesn't come out. So a quick peek at our gear in there may tell us why. There's a little bit more debris than you'll typically have in these systems in there, so that could be part of the reason why our little shaft and splines are kind of gummed up in here. So we'll keep messing with it. I should be able at this point just to pull this whole inner shaft out. We'll take our nut and lock washer off. If that's the way it wants to go, voila. Here you can see the teeth on this pinion that ride, the teeth ride in this rack on the inside here that mesh together. And there is a little timing mechanism. There's a little spacer that's down in there. There's a couple little details we'll pay attention to on reassembly. But for now, the goal is to get the rest of these pieces here apart. That's something. That is a first for me, but that's what makes it interesting. I don't know if it'll help. I'm going to go ahead and take the worm gear out. A couple little bolts at the top, and there's some shims in between this front cover and the box. But maybe I can turn him out. Maybe I can get some more access underneath the pinion to get some better leverage on it. Okay, shims, bolts. Now, there are a set of little roller bearing balls up in here, and those will fall out and roll all over the place if you don't catch them. So same on each end. You can see top and bottom. There's a clip that holds them in, so they're not just going to fall out on their own, but on each end there's a clip, but you want to keep track of those when you take them apart. Viola. Look at that. Usually I just clean up these bearings, but needless to say, we're not going to reuse that. And when we do our initial disassembly, this is what typically happens. This guy just comes right out. So here's our pieces broken down now that we're apart. You can see this little mini shaft fits in the splines there. And one thing to watch is where these pins engage this worm gear. You can get wear there. And it looks like that forward pin is worn a little bit. The back one, not so bad. They make replacement pins that you can put in here, because too much wear on these, it'll wiggle back and forth as you're going down the road and cause wobbly steering. So keep keep an eye on that. Yeah, now we'll go ahead and just jump over to the rest of our pedestal assembly. We're going to go ahead and pull this piston unit, rack and all, out with these 4 9/16 head bolts. There we go. So now we've got our, it's going to be backwards. We're just going to pull out our piston. There's our spacer that's going to, the spacer sits up inside here when everything goes back together, so we'll keep that handy. And then here, our rack is held onto our piston, little clip and a pin. I'm not going to worry about that right away, but I'm going to try and separate this cap from the housing of the piston itself, and I don't know if I can do that simply by pulling it. Oh, probably not. Didn't eat my Wheaties enough today. There we go. There's the cap. There's going to be some O-rings that help us with our seal. And then there is our piston in there, which is going to create a little bit of friction as we try to pull him out. He is going to be the part that's going to be oily. Boop, just like that. Got a couple O-rings. Our piston rings usually are usable on the end of the piston itself, and this just simply, this rack, when the gear moves, it moves back and forth in there with that piston, sending the fluid back and forth. So, in our steering pedestal casting, there is a needle bearing down in here, and below that is an oil seal down there in the bottom. In past cases, I have been known to leave this needle bearing in here and just punch out the oil seal and replace it. This one's a little more compromised than I care to leave in there though, so we're going to punch him out. This pinion that sits in here, it's not a very high, I guess there's not real fast speeds that turn that back and forth. I'm usually comfortable leaving the original there. But as you can see, there's a lot of yuck in there that we need to clean out. So I'm just going to go and use the socket on an extension trick, drop it in there, and then go ahead and see if I can pound him out. I heard the seal fall out. There's our seal. And there we go. There's our bearing. That is, well, a little bit of effort. We have our power steering pedestal components cleaned up, ready for the next step. Nothing too serious was encountered during the cleanup process. My steering box had a little bit of a crack up on the top part. Noticed that when I was cleaning it up. So I have replacements, or extras. I went and got a replacement. All good. Gonna replace the seals, top and bottom on that eventually. Our main casting here is gonna get a new needle bearing and seal down on the inside there. I found replacements for this little horizontal steering shaft. This one didn't have as much wear as my original did. You can kind of see maybe where that's all sort of circled out at the end. So we'll replace that. I also found a little bit better vertical shaft. The little pins that engage the worm gear on my original were kind of worn. These look a little better, so we're gonna use that guy. But everything cleaned up fairly nice. One thing to pay attention to on your rack and piston unit is the piston rod. You want to make sure that that's free of defects. There's a little O-ring that fits inside this piece here. I don't know if you can see it down in there. And that will slide back and forth on the shaft. Make sure you don't have any rough edges, corrosion on there to nick up that O-ring, keep the oil where it's supposed to be. We're going to move forward with our power steering rack and pinion piston subassembly. We're just going to replace 3 O-rings in the process. They all fit in this little plate here. One O-ring sits down inside that little groove in there. One O-ring is going to sit in this groove here. The last one's going to fit in between the pedestal and this plate when we mount our whole assembly to that pedestal in the front. This plate will pass over the shaft first, followed by piston on the end. O-ring part numbers. I believe the little guy here is a P48347. The one in this groove here is going to be, originally it's a M4237T, but I think that changes to a T16318. And then the one that goes in between the housing and the other housing, M4236T, if you like the details. Grease up our O-ring a little bit, make it slide on easier. Piston. Now we're going to take this over to the vise, kind of anchor it so we can tighten our nut. So we've tightened up our nut. Now we have to try and compress our rings to fit down in our bore. There's one. Let's see if we can get 2. And there's 2. We can push him in, snap him in place, and this guy can turn, so it doesn't matter which way. He's ultimately going to go like so. But for now, we're going to tape up our openings. Set him off to the side so we can move on to our next piece. Now that we have our rack and piston assembly sealed back together, we can move forward with cleaning up the bench a little bit and throwing some more components together on our pedestal here. I went ahead and put new seals in our steering box. There's one where the steering shaft comes in here, and then one on the bottom where the little shaft here will drop down through. So 2 new seals there. I also put a new needle bearing down in our main housing. Sometimes I'll reuse the original, but this one was fairly rusty, so we put a new bearing in there, and then we also put a new seal down in the bottom of this housing. Probably start with putting the main shaft down through this big housing, kind of work our way up, add everything on there, and get our pedestal buttoned up. So dropping our pinion into our housing is kind of as simple as it sounds. A couple things to pay attention to on our pinion is there's some timing marks on one of our teeth of the pinion. Kind of marked it with markers so you can see the little punch marks a little bit better. That timing mark has to go in a certain position with our teeth, basically the first slot on our rack here. There's another timing mark up at the top, just so I guess we can get everything centered when the time comes. I mean, I think at this stage you can really put the tie rods wherever you need to as far as on the splines, and we can rotate our upper shaft where we need to. So I'm not sure how critical it is, but we're gonna follow the rules and time everything up the way it should be. In our housing, let's see, I don't know what the best viewpoint is. In the back here, I can see it. There is a little kind of a recess in there, and this little thrust plate goes in there with some shims. It might be the easiest time to put those in there now. There is a setting that one pays attention to and follows with the manual, but this is the same setup that we took out, so I think putting those back in where they came out should be sufficient. I think there's like a 1,000th preload on the back of our rack that the manual calls for. So those are in there. Just don't bend this thing or flop this thing around now, because those will fall back out. We have our thrust washer. That beveled edge, I believe, goes up against the gear. Put him on there like so. And then we'll put a little bit of grease in our bearing in there just to reduce friction. Try and get our seal a little bit in there too. Then we could, in theory, just slide this guy right in. This bearing, it is the original bearing. I just reused the one we had. I mean, this isn't really a high pressure, high stress area. This bearing seems to roll fine. It's going to probably fit somewhat snug against our edge of our housing here, but not in a way that's going to be difficult to install. Gotta be careful to not abuse the bearing in our seal as we slide this in. And there we go. If the light will allow it, let's see what I can use for a prop here. Try and get in view our tooth down there. If you can see it, I have that tooth with the marks kind of looking at us in the opening there. And that tooth, again, is going to go in this first recess of our rack assembly. This is where we go ahead and put our seal, in this case an O-ring, on our little housing here. He's going to go on and fit just in there like so. That O-ring is basically all that is there. There's no gasket on this one. And usually we put, I think, like a gear oil down in here as a lubricant, so it's a good measure. I may put just a tiny film of silicone for the metal-to-metal parts here. So O-ring, got our rack. I need to try to get that first tooth lined up in there. I'm sorry, I don't have a better viewing angle for what's about to take place. That O-ring's going to want to pop out of there. Okay, so I'm kind of winging it. I do not know if we were successful in lining our teeth up or not. I'll try and make sure that O-ring isn't pinched. Let's just throw a bolt in here for good measure for now. So I suppose what we can do is we'll try and look in our little inspection window on the other side and see if we were successful or if we're off a notch in our tooth alignment. Alright, so I slightly snugged up one of our bolts here to kind of hold this guy in place. So now we're going to try and do a flopperoo and see if we can inspect on this end. Which we should get a pretty good view here if I can set this up appropriately. Got too many components in the way here. Never enough room on the workbench, it seems. Alright, so if I am able to turn, look at that, right where it should be. You can see our tooth with the marks fit right in that slot with our rack. Couldn't ask for a better alignment. First time's a trick. Now we can go ahead and snug up the rest of these bolts, and our piston assembly will be secured in place. So our main pinion is down in the center of our housing. We have our piston rack assembly in place. Next we can probably add on our spacer tower here. It'll go on. Deere does not offer this gasket any longer, so we got to make our own. And we'll see how good of a gasket maker I really am. Okay, all trimmed up. This guy can fit right over the top on there. Snug those up for now. I'm going to go back and we'll trim off some of this excess gasket here to clean that up a little bit. But having that in place means we can move on to our next component, the steering box. And I think I'm going to set this big guy off to the side for a minute. Set you over here. And we'll bring our steering box over. So the steering box has this worm that's going to fit in there. Moved our bearings up with corn head grease. It's kind of a fascinating substance that's kind of this liquidy but kind of solidy, sort of sticks to everything. It's kind of a good material for these steering boxes. Going to slide our worm gear in there. Through the seal on the other side. And then we're going to put our cap back on. Specifications for the shims are to leave like a slight drag on our steering worm up here. So we're just going to kind of put these in and sort of snug them up for now, and we'll check on that drag here. I think the manual says like 2 to 5 pounds, which right now I'm just using the original shims that were under there, which I mean one would think in theory that would be sufficient. But it does seem to want to bind things up, so I'm going to have to go back and find some more shims to put in there so we have a little bit of drag. Maybe I mixed my two steering boxes up when I had everything apart, but we'll put another shim or two in there and we'll tighten that up. But for video purposes, we'll keep going in that we can actually now mount this guy on the top of our big pedestal. This coupling here, this is the one that gave us some trouble getting everything apart. It was all fused up in there. We can try and get him lined up on our pinion on the inside, down in there. So he's in place. And then our steering box is simply a bolt, and then a bolt and a nut. So we have those somewhat snugged up. Okay, now before we just randomly slide our little pinion up at the top in here, we need to make sure everything is, centering does kind of have an issue at this point, because we got to make sure our piston is centered with our main pinion, and we want to have this piece, these teeth centered in our worm gear. So I'm going to try and do that. That may play a role in where our little, I don't know if we can see it down in there, where our little mark is on the top of that main pinion, but the manual doesn't make any mention of it. So what I'm going to do is try and turn this shaft all that way. And as far as it'll go that way. And then kind of make a judgment as to where the center is, which would be right about there. I'm going to say, based on my very scientific analysis, that is centered on our main pinion. And I can't see how that dot really plays any relevance one way or the other. But then what we have to do is try and slide this pinion in there in a way where it's going to be centered, which this kind of is, in the middle of our steering box here. So now what we're going to see what we can do is if we can turn it's all the way that way. Let's see if we can give a little bit more of a tap. Go back our other way. looks like we have a little bit more room to go there. Okay, up against the front. Up against the back there. Now, I think one way or the other, we're going to have to call it good enough as far as being where we need it to be. I mean, being in the center there, that makes the most sense that this shaft is in the center here. So I think that's where we'll leave it. We can get it on the tractor, and then what we can do once it's on the tractor is, of course, put our tie rods in at the bottom, rotate it back and forth full cycle, and make sure that our tires do what they want to do, or what we want them to do, when the time comes to bolt everything up and tighten it up for the final time. With this guy on there, we can take our little cap. Now there is a gasket that's going to go underneath this cap. I'm going to avoid using that gasket for now because I still think there's going to be some adjustment that's going to take place. So these are going to go on just like so. I do believe that gasket's still available from John Deere. Now here we can tighten this guy down, and that's going to keep that little pinion that's in there from wanting to bump up and down, and sort of lock it in place just for now. We should still be able to move back and forth with ease. A little inspection cover that goes on this side. Again, John Deere does not offer that gasket anymore either, so we'll make our own. We'll put it on there, cover him up. Again, for now, we're just going to put him on there and probably forget that we didn't put the gasket on later and have a bunch of oil run out. But then we got our big bolt that goes up in front. This was a lot of times you can mount a cultivator or some other front mount attachment on these tractors with that big bolt. So that's what that guy's all about. And that gets us to this point here, where we more or less have a rebuilt 420, 430, or 440 power steering pedestal. We do need to go back and add in a couple gaskets of shim to get everything where it's going to be finalized, but for the sake of an assembly video, it should be pretty sufficient. With this guy done, we'll be able to move on to chapter 3, which is our power steering pump. He's over here waiting to be discovered. So that'll be up next. Appreciate you watching the pedestal component, and see you next time.